Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Creative Care webinar series. It is wonderful to have you with us today. And for those who it's your first time, thank you for joining us. And thank you for those who are returning again. And as always, find a comfortable position. Go ahead and have your lunch, your tea, and your coffee, and tune in today's conversation. And welcome to July. My name is Christen Kong, and I'm a health promoter at Access Alliance Multicultural Health and Community Services, where I really focus on advancing newcomer mental health and well-being through the arts. One of my favorite things is doing these webinars, which is part of capacity building and really mobilizing knowledge that we've learned in the many decades at Access Alliance about arts integration, so that we can really meaningfully shape everyday practice and community care. So today we are excited to host our fourth Creative Care webinar, part of a six-part series to advance the integration of arts within healthcare and settlement. This series is funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, part of the Hubs of Expressive Arts for Life project. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. I would like to acknowledge also the lands in which many of us are gathered here today. Those of us in Takaranto are on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As an organization serving immigrants and refugees facing systemic barriers, we recognize the ongoing impacts of colonialism on Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And we honor the resilience and resistance of Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. So today's webinar is titled Weaving Stories and Data. Have you ever wondered how to measure the efficacy of an expressive arts program? Or the difference between art-based evaluation versus evaluating art-based programs using mixed methods? Well, you're in the right place because today's session explores just that. What does implementation research look like in an arts context? How to measure the impacts of expressive arts for specific newcomer mental health and well-being populations. We will hear from two of our HEAL project fellows and one of our advisory committee members on practical strategies for integrating research into programs. Also, how to strengthen participatory designs, addressing challenges in gender-based violence research, and also how to scale up some of these ideas that we've found through the project. So as always, I am not doing this alone. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. So first up, we are welcoming back Shruti Anna Thomas. She is a Master's of Public Health student at the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa, with experience in community-based participatory action research in India and Toronto. She was also our Research HEAL Fellow from 2024 to 25, and she supported the implementation of evaluation tools, did a huge lot of data analysis, and trained many of our peer researchers and volunteers. Next up, we have Jasmine Sidhu in our yellow background. She is a psychology PhD student based in Toronto, focusing on the impacts of domestic violence on children using mixed method research in community-based and applied research in public health and gender-based violence contexts. Jasmine was our final HEAL Fellow from 2025 to 26 and worked a lot and continued data analysis as well as knowledge mobilization. And lastly, in our red background, we have Dr. Ruth Wilson. She is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at King's University College, an affiliation of Western University, and she specializes in community-based research, the racialization of poverty, immigrant integration, and anti-poverty organizing. And I have to say, Ruth helped us so much hire many of our HEAL facilitators, so very supportive throughout the whole process of this project. So thank you, Ruth, for being here. And then lastly, to structure our discussion, I will invite our panelists to respond to 3 to 4 guiding questions. Each panelist will have the opportunity to share their perspectives and experiences. And throughout the webinar, we encourage you as audience members to submit questions and reflections in our Q&A feature, a part of the Zoom. So it's just at the bottom menu there. And we will get to them with the reserved time at the end of the session. And the questions that we don't get to, we will respond to them in our follow-up email after the session. And we always get this question, and yes, all these sessions will be recorded and sent out to everyone. All right, so with all of that, let's begin with our first question. So our first question, what is the most useful quantitative or qualitative indicators for measuring the impact of expressive arts on mental health and well-being? So that is a loaded question. So I'm going to pass that to Shruti to begin our conversation.
Thank you, Christen, for the question, and thank you for having me on this panel. I feel like before I talk about the most useful quantitative and qualitative indicators, maybe a very brief background regarding how the HEAL indicators were developed. The HEAL project indicators, they were shaped by two factors. One was the requirements from the Public Health Agency of Canada grant, which supports the HEAL project. And the other aspect was an extensive form of co-design process that we undertook at very early stages of the project. So this co-design process kind of brought together experts on gender-based violence, artists, healthcare service providers, researchers, people in policy-related roles, and immigration and settlement providers. And all of this multi-sectoral input ensured that our indicators were kind of grounded in what was meaningful for the communities that we were serving, while also being thorough in research and actually measuring what needs to be measured in the way that it has to be measured in this particular setting. So that is the brief background. Now, when it comes to quantitative indicators that have been like most useful, I would say the ones that measure changes in knowledge, like the mental health knowledge and awareness, and the ones that measured how the capacity to share regarding their lived experiences within the expressive arts group and with friends and family, how these things changed over the span of the program. These indicators measured in a quantitative manner were able to capture like discrete program attributable shifts within the participants. We did this through Likert scale surveys. And when I do say that these were the useful indicators, we did measure a couple of other indicators too through quantitative measures, but some of them also had challenges associated with being measured in a quantitative manner, because especially when you try to measure sense of belonging and mental well-being through Likert scale scores or surveys, what we noticed was that sometimes the scores would capture how the participants were feeling or how they were feeling on that particular day or in that particular week, which is influenced by other things beyond the program too. And how we addressed this was by triangulating the Likert scales with the qualitative data that we collected, rather than treating them as standalone evidences of impact. So along with the usefulness of quantitative indicators, there are other things that needs to be navigated when it comes to the implementation. Now, similarly, when it comes to the qualitative indicators, I would say that was our richest evidence of impact. And the most useful, I would say, was the indicator which kind of tried to understand how participants have continued in self-initiated engagement with expressive arts after the program has ended. So the questions surrounding this indicator kind of gave us a lot of examples where participants shared that they're using art modalities to communicate better with their younger children, as in moments of tension, rather than defaulting to frustration or angry outburst. They're able to handle those situations better. Some others shared that they have been using music and movement related activities at home as a self-regulation practice to reduce their stress. So this particular one is what I would like to highlight as a useful indicator in qualitative. But again, the qualitative also had its own challenges because um, sometimes being introduced to expressive arts, participants prefer to draw their responses to some of our qualitative survey questions rather than writing a paragraph or, uh, for example, when we asked how they are feeling engaging with expressive arts, they would prefer to draw flowers or the sun be with sometimes rather than actually writing down that they were feeling happy or any other particular emotion, like naming an emotion or things like that. So that I would say are some of the things that I would like to highlight regarding the useful qualitative and quantitative indicators, alongside some of the implementation challenges also that we have faced while implementing the evaluation tools.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shruti. And thank you for bringing up that context. That really rich knowledge that came out of our code design was so helpful and important. And for those who are working on grants at the moment, yeah, what does that look like? Because a lot of grants, or the ones that we work with, had very high level indicators, but how do we make those also detailed and minute so that it suited the population that we worked with? So thank you, Shruti, for sharing that. So I'm going to pass it now to Jasmine.
So I just wanted to add to what Shruti had said. I agree with all the indicators she talked about, but I also want to highlight the relationship between quantitative and qualitative indicators. So one thing I learned through working on the HEAL project is that you really need both the quantitative and qualitative data to understand the impact of expressive arts. Expressive arts, measuring it's very different from our traditional research projects. So, like the numbers that we had found can tell us whether the change occurred, but they don't always tell you why or how and what the change looked like. So, when I was analyzing the data for like knowledge mobilization, on the quantitative side, some of the most useful indicators that I found were confidence, self-esteem, feelings of social connectedness, awareness of community resources, and what really stood out to me was the reductions in self-blame or helplessness. So, these type of measures really helped us to track changes over time and demonstrate the impact and what organizations and funders can understand. And then again, this is important for sustainability of such projects. But equally, I found the qualitative indicators important because through interviews, focus groups, and then participant reflections, even facilitator observations, we were able to better understand the experiences of the participants. How Shruti had mentioned, like talking about artwork that was done to explain a question or an answer, it really helped put perspective into what the participant was feeling. So sometimes maybe a participant may not show like a dramatic change on a survey, but when they were describing feeling safe for the first time or forming a meaningful relationship or even finding ways to express their emotion, these were all in our qualitative indicators, and this was much different from the quantitative surveys. So during my work while analyzing the HEAL data, one of the biggest takeaways for me was that qualitative findings often give context to quantitative results, and together they provided a much richer understanding of how expressive arts contributed to the participants' mental health and well-being. So for me, it was mostly like, okay, all the indicators are really important, but how do they correlate and how do they work together? And it brings again attention to mixed methods research, how both types of research, quantitative and qualitative, are really important to understand nuance and participant experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, the power of mixed methods for sure. So I'm going to pass this now to Ruth.
Yeah, I don't want to waste our time by reiterating everything that's been said. I totally agree. The magic of these mixed methods is super powerful in evaluation. I know as someone who does a lot of evaluation consultation, particularly around arts-based projects, we can tend to be very focused on symptom reduction through the pre and post. But I do think to capture the magic of arts-based work, we need to be journey focused. And how are people, what felt different, asking people what felt different, what felt unsafe, asking them to reflect on changes in their own words are super important, and sometimes maybe using arts-based methods to help them articulate that. I think one thing I can add is something we're learning in my work is the magic of a developmental evaluation approach, where it's kind of more kind of integrated in part everyday program design and implementation, and thinking about the arts-based facilitator as a really good place of data through reflection, using observational methods, using deep field notes. What are they seeing as a way to fill in the picture that you're receiving from participants? The other thing I would just want to say, and I'd be interested in or ask, throw out there, and I'm so interested in what other panelists are thinking, is one thing I'm struggling to really measure is because I do most of the arts-based work that I engage with is community focused, right? Community advocacy, and art is such a powerful critical consciousness raising tool. And how do we measure critical consciousness raising? And there are, again, a few pre-post tools out there to help us do that, but there's something about the critical consciousness raising experience that is very process based. And so I think very much working through what does that journey look like, and how I would be so interested in knowing how participants themselves are defining this journey through their own language.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. And I'm really glad that you brought up facilitators as part of this process of understanding data that we collect from participants, because you're right, facilitators have that unique position of being with, experiencing with participants. And, our facilitator logs, which we'll be talking about more in next week's webinar, is what did they observe and how did that support so much of the data that we saw? And yeah, I think a question that came up a lot is how are we rigorous with research while doing art-based, right? And they're not separate things. And I think there's a lot of evidence out there of integrating both arts and research. But one thing I did note that we noticed as a team in the beginning is that so many settlement and healthcare agencies do a lot of art-based work, but sometimes the evaluation is sometimes forgotten or sometimes not taken seriously. And so that kind of leads to this secondary question of how do we integrate data collection within a program that is so abstract and transformative using the arts without disrupting participant safety or engagement? And I will just add a little something. Working with newcomers, many of them have hesitation filling out quantitative surveys or answering interview questions because of, privacy of identity. And so, yeah, that is the question. So I'm going to pass it to Jasmine to start us off with this.
So, although I joined the HEAL project in its final year and was primarily working on data analysis and knowledge mobilization, reviewing the evaluation process really gave me an appreciation for how the research was designed for data collection. So, participants for HEAL really attended the project. The programs to connect and heal were not necessarily to participate in research. So, for me, when I was reviewing how data was collected, the evaluation never felt intrusive or was the main focus of the program, but rather it was integrated naturally at different points. So there was the pre-program survey, post-program survey, and follow-ups throughout. I think what helped really was keeping the surveys brief and using clear, concise, and accessible language, which made it more comfortable for the participants. And also, it was translated into their language, which was definitely helpful. Reviewing the data, also, they mentioned that sometimes you don't have literal translations from English to a native language. So, having someone who speaks the native language and finding more conversational translations is definitely helpful rather than just maybe using Google Translate to find literal definitions, because a lot of the times the words don't exist in other languages, and that caused confusion for some individuals. But for the most important thing is obviously building trust. Participants should understand why the data is collecting and knowing that participation was voluntary. And then also, like, some questions were might have triggered certain emotions. So being sure and letting them know that you can skip this question. You don't have to necessarily participate in data collection if it makes you uncomfortable, because again, the main goal of this program was to heal and to use expressive arts for trauma healing. Um, so talking about newcomer communities, like offering materials in preferred languages is definitely helpful, but working with community organizations help to facilitate more trust and comfort within participants. So using a trusted source within the community or an individual or an organization is definitely a way to connect with participants rather than an outsider just going in and being like, okay, we're here to collect data. You want to use someone that's already in the community and is understanding of their environment and their conditions. So for me, ultimately, like participant well-being should come before data collection. That's why like community-based research is so important, that we are working with the community rather than the community or the participants working for us. And if someone needs support, is distressed, or the questions are causing more issues, like research can wait. We need to help provide the resources, and then I'm sure there's another participant who will be able to answer those questions if we don't get enough number of participants. That's also okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine, for bringing up the participant-centered or person-centered perspective when we approach research. And I know, Ruth, you've done many community-based research projects, so I would love to hear your take on this question.
Yeah, I think Jasmine like really sings a lot of this of what I would be singing in the choir as well. It's very important to me that evaluation feels like part of the program and not an interruption to the program, so that yeah, so that it can be, and that can look in many different ways. But I think if when evaluation like operates parallel instead of integrated, then it can feel very extractive and less relational. And it's with that relational, process-oriented approach that I think builds trust. So a lot of the times at the top of a program, I will have conversations with participants and facilitators to say, like, this is how we learn. How are we going to learn from each other? How are we going to document what we learn about the process that we're engaging together? And a lot of that time, I find that participants really enjoy soft, small touch points over like separated tools that kind of interrupts the flow and the magic of the program. So we're always trying to be, me and my colleagues, quite creative around what these small touch points look like. Maybe it's a closeout activity after every session. It could be brief journaling. It depends on the group and the focus. With a lot of newcomers, we kind of always ask them to share a poem from their home that will identify their feelings. We do a translation, and people kind of very process oriented, like something that will ask them to reflect about the process itself and how it's making them feel, what changes that they bring. So bringing something from their own culture to the table as a form of expression of how what change feels like to them. So trying to be more creative around engaging in a more integrated relational way. But again, this should be, especially in because we live in the real world with funders and like yeah, indicators of measurement that need to be served upward. These things need to be complemented with, again, like hard measures as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Thank you for sharing about the invitation to bring people into the process of data collection too, that asking them, what works, what doesn't work, being very transparent about that. I love that cultural element too of tailoring it to different cultures. And those touch points are so good because that's exactly what we also saw too, is that having predictability at the end of the session, knowing that we're going to do a checkout that's more reflective, help them to prepare themselves, to be like, Okay, I will be sharing something that I learned or experienced in the session, and that really helped kind of draw that out. But yeah, the foundational is the relational piece. And how we do that is slow and intentional. So I'm going to pass this to Shruti now.
Yeah, this is amazing. I mean, I'm gonna echo a lot of things that Jasmine and Ruth has already spoken. The point that Jasmine spoke about patient well-being and safety being the first and primary priority over anything else, that is definitely something that we really really implemented as much as possible in our HEAL evaluation process. And Ruth, to what you mentioned about integrating programming and evaluation so that it doesn't feel as separate worlds, because it is this, it shouldn't feel like separate worlds to this one single participant who is attending, the program. Like, so that is again something that we noticed and we tried to address to. So when it comes to participant well-being and safety, um, I would say that what we did was surveys and forms, they were only shared with participants only after ensuring that there is no immediate or pressing participant need that needs to be addressed. Like they're not coming in with like a landlord issue or any kind of conflict that is troubling them. Like we took care to have the conversations necessary to speak to those conflicts before moving into even the programming or the surveys or the evaluation. And also we tried our best to ensure that the session environment had a welcoming space. We had these check-in activities as well as personal check-in conversations with participants. Hey, how are you doing? How are things going? We took time to build that trust and relationship, and that was really helpful in helping us collect the evaluation data that we were looking for. And also in terms of environment, even simple things like having music, having food ready on the table and like available to them from the point that they walked into the room, all of this kind of enhanced the session environment and kind of flowed together with the programming and the evaluation aspects. And also, as you said, evaluation tools, they were never like a person walks into the session and we don't hand them out a survey or a form. Never, ever. We always made sure that the evaluation tools were either between two arts based activities or towards the close of a session before we had like the checkout conversation. So those were things that we also tried as much as possible to implement because we could see how it changed the experience of the participants into a very safety and well-being oriented one rather than a rigorous research just implemented at like certain points of time in a day. So that was something that we did. And then integrating data collection with the team. So as we were saying, you cannot compartmentalize the research and the programming. It has to flow. And for us, our team, which included the peer researchers, the volunteers, the expressive art therapists, all of them had a role to play in the success of the data collection because in every room of the HEAL program, the expressive art therapist or the lead facilitator, he or she was the lead person. So they provided the introduction or the natural segue into now we have a very different kind of activity to complete before we move into our next arts based activity. So they gave that lead, which was followed up by the peer researcher and the research fellow taking the lead, taking the stage and explaining this is the tool that, or this is the survey or the form that needs to be completed and this is the objective or the reasoning behind this particular form, and also the considerations regarding anonymity and there is no obligation to answer every question. All of that was explained. And we also try to explain that we are here to answer any questions or clarifications that you might have, like we are in the room with you. So all of this kind of helped to integrate the data collection with the programming. And when I speak about team composition, I think it is important to highlight that all the staff present in the room has to be supportive to the participants. It's it's not good to have like an audience observers because that kind of really changes how freely and honestly participants engage with the expressive arts program or even with the research process. That was something that we observed. And in terms of integrating program and data, I would say another key success that I noticed was we had these art and culture visits, which were sprinkled in between our 3-month follow ups and 6-month follow ups, which kind of ensured that we had that constant connection with the participants, both to engage them in the arts as well as to listen to their needs and be able to address them the best way that we can, so that when we reached out for the evaluations at 3-month and 6-month, it's not just a very mechanical process where you're reaching out. You have these long-standing connections and relationships being built, not just as a single person like me, but as HEAL team, as Access Alliance, or our partner organization as an agency. So that kind of linkage also really helped us to intertwine the programming and the research aspects in HEAL.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. I love your concrete examples. And thank you for highlighting too, not only were we evaluating an arts program, but we use art itself for the flow, for that bridging, whether that was, music in the background. I think one very small but impactful thing that we did was we allowed people to use markers, colorful markers, to mark up all their, survey pages, their qualitative. So bring creativity and fun into the process because it really does help and matter. Which brings me to, and thank you everyone who has been putting some really great questions in the Q&A. So we'll get to that very soon. And I will say, this work is not easy. Doing community work, especially collecting data, is not easy. And so I want to pose to our panelists, what are some challenges that you've experienced when conducting research with, gender-based violence communities or other vulnerable communities? And what were specific strategies that helped address them in your experience? So I'll pass this to Ruth to get us started with this question.
Sure. So I think I personally don't have a lot of experience with gender-based violence. That's not like my specific area of focus, but I do work with many, I think, quote, vulnerable populations, quote, at-risk populations, as they're defined. So I think for me, some of the challenges um, is always balancing the need to do evaluation, the value of that learning with the risk of re-traumatizing folks. And how do we balance that? Especially when we are asking them questions about changes in their own either symptoms or healing process, and to make sure that evaluation doesn't backpedal anything the program has accomplished in that way. And so that is, and I don't think there's any simple strategy to do that. I think it's really, really specific to groups, to a group, to a person, to a facilitator. I think the other challenge, and I'll name some challenges first, and then maybe because a lot of the strategies I think overlap in my personal experience, is of course making sure that evaluation doesn't feel somehow extractive or like people are suddenly being used by the program for research. And how do we again keep the process relational in a way so that it doesn't feel like all of a sudden I'm a subject in the program but an object in the evaluation. That is kind of a big challenge. And then, of course, it depends on the dynamics. If it's not an integrated approach, then evaluators swooping in have no pre-existing relationships around trust, and that can be a big barrier. So those are kind of the dynamics. And a lot of these, I think you can head off by, again, using a developmental approach, or as Shruti has said, kind of making sure that those who are doing the evaluations are somehow integrated and have a place of relationship, have an ongoing relationship with participants is for me the strongest way to keep evaluation to address a lot of these kind of challenges. One strategy, again, I know I mentioned it, is right up front, is to do some collaborative evaluation design ahead of the program, right? So that they are feel ownership over that process as much as they feel ownership over their participation in the program itself. And what's really unique about that is now you're getting into measures of change and success from their eyes. So you can get a sense of what will feel safe in terms of, oh, I am so sorry. I don't know how to, sorry. Sorry. Oh, what will feel safe in terms of their engagement, if they want group support, if they want to do it privately, letting them define the terms of the evaluation before you go in, and doing some co-design in that way. I think in terms of like the developmental approaches, I think very positive, making sure that it's integrated. Um, the co-design is super important from my perspective and has been super successful. I think the other pieces are really about the folks doing evaluation themselves, right? To understand that participatory research, community-based research, developmental evaluations, these are relational processes. And to understand that they also need to be flexible processes, right? That we cannot worry so much about methodological weakness over the relationships we build, and that ethical rigor is actually way more important, right? Around building trust, protecting participants from re-traumatization, and to realize that if it's done well, it should feel like a lot of emotional labor, right? Because you are investing in the relationships and holding their experiences very dear, and making sure that power in the process is distributed in a way to them that feels very safe. And I think I'll stop there. And I'm so sorry about my phone.
Oh, no, don't even worry. I mean, thank you, Ruth, for bringing those wisdoms to light. And I really appreciated that you're talking about this shift, right? Subject to contributor, that participants are contributors. And I know one of our in-program surveys, one of the questions is, do you have questions for us? So as much as we're asking them questions, they are also free to ask us questions. And I think that helped to kind of mitigate that dynamic of subject and then bringing that to contributor. And the other piece that I like that you're circling back around is that facilitators matter. Who conducts and collects the research matters. And especially if you're going to be a little bit more creative and experimental, we as researchers need to engage in that ourselves. Like, let us, practice interviewing with each other. How does that feel on our own bodies and our minds and our souls? So, anyways, thank you, Ruth. I'm going to pass that to Jasmine now.
So much of my research has been based in domestic violence and gender-based violence. So the biggest lesson I've learned so far is that gender-based violence is truly built on trust and relationships. When we take a participant's well-being as first, we are able to collect higher quality data, and then we're able to create stronger partnerships with the community and the participants, and also produce findings that are more likely to improve services and inform policy rather than just extracting data to say maybe write a good paper or publish something. We're actually doing something that is much more meaningful. Uh, through research and gender-based violence, I've learned that a trauma-informed approach is essential. So meaning that the impact of trauma is recognized and allowing participants to remain in control of what they share, reminding that they can skip questions, withdraw at any time, and ensuring that emotional safety is prioritized throughout the whole research process. Again, I'm going to echo stuff Ruth has said, and it's again building onto the conversation that consent should be viewed as an ongoing conversation, not just something that's obtained at the beginning of a research project, because when working with vulnerable populations, there's so much that can change at any point, and they might not consent to what they originally consented to. So it's being mindful that an individual's conditions are constantly changing depending on what they're going through and learning how to adapt. So one of the biggest challenges, like I mentioned, is building trust. Many participants, particularly newcomers, have experienced trauma, discrimination, or negative interactions, especially with the system in the past, whether from their native country or the new country they've immigrated to. So it's really important that we acknowledge that they might be hesitant to share their personal experiences due to fear, stigma, any other concern. And it's also uncertain how they are also uncertain how their information will be used. So they might not feel comfortable sharing, or they might, I don't want to say lie, but they might fabricate what they want to share just to feel safe within the program. So another challenge is like balancing research with participant well-being. People often attend these programs, like we mentioned many times, for healing and support, not to participate in research and become quote unquote guinea pigs. But it's really important to find an ethical way to collect data. And it's like important that it doesn't feel intrusive. And we find being okay with collecting less data, because if that makes the participant feel more comfortable. And speaking to newcomer populations, cultural responsiveness is equally as important. Every community has different experiences, beliefs, and comfort levels when discussing topics such as gender-based violence and domestic violence, or even mental health. So, providing translated materials, working with multilingual facilitators, and adapting research tools to be appropriate is really important. So, maybe on the West, we might consider something not appropriate, like, oh my God, this is an indicator of gender-based violence, but where they're from, it might not be, it might be a cultural norm. So how do we thread that line of being culturally responsive and appropriate, but also being able to do our job as researchers? My doctoral research on child victimization and inter-partner violence really has reinforced the same principles, whether we're working directly with survivors or studying violence broadly. The most important thing is ethical, participant-centered research, where participants feel safe and respected and in control. So research is not only more ethical, but the data is more strong and meaningful because participants are more comfortable sharing their true experiences. And one of my supervisors once mentioned you always have to have plan A, B, C, D, E, because anything can change, especially when you're working with such vulnerable populations or topics. So it's like being able to pivot when you need to, and changing your approach depending on who you're working with is super important.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you for bringing up the importance of flexibility and adaptability and realizing this is slow research, right? Trust doesn't just happen overnight. It takes sometimes decades to build, enough relations with certain communities, and also having compassion on ourselves. Something that popped into my mind as you were speaking is accepting the limitations of data collection, that there's so much richness off the record that we know and we hear, but to honor participants, sometimes, data collection does have limitations, and that's, the realities of research. Um, and so I'm gonna pass this to Shruti. Yeah.
Yeah. Before I move into the question, but what you said right now, Kristen, about data collection having its limitation, we collected extensive, it's not as part of research, but we had team debriefs, facilitator debriefs, in which so much of the changes that was happening within the group was something that the facilitators could see over time, but maybe the participants, because they are going through the process, is not able to actually describe. I think this relates to that. I'm not really familiar, but Ruth, you mentioned about that change in consciousness. Like the facilitators actually speak when you talk to them at 3 month and 6 month, like how when they come in contact with the participants again, they notice how their vocabulary has changed around mental health, around violence, around seeking help um, to heal from trauma, all those things. But these are not things that the participants themselves might be able to verbalize, even if you ask like a direct question at them. So that was something interesting that popped into my mind. But regarding challenges regarding conducting research in gender-based violence context, I think Jasmine and Ruth has quite comprehensively covered almost all of it. Um, Personally, I think I would say for me too, the main challenge was avoiding re traumatization when you're implementing these evaluation tools. Because even if it's a screening question and all that you expect from the participant is a yes or a no, for them to give you that yes or no regarding are you comfortable sharing your experiences in a group, they have to think back like what are those experiences, like even though they don't have to verbalize it, they do have to in their mind relive those experiences to make that decision and just respond to you yes or no as to whether or not they're happy to they're willing to share about these experiences. So that re-traumatization piece is something of a core challenge, especially in evaluation, because you are trying to measure uh, a lot of sensitive aspects. And I would say the specific strategy would be Jasmine mentioned this already about trauma informed practice and patient centered research. So, specifically, trauma informed practice, like first and foremost, before moving into this form of evaluation or programming work, being able to understand the impact of trauma and how it manifests differently across different populations, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma and actively resisting re traumatization in every step of your interaction. So, uh, this trauma informed approach, like we had a lot of peer researcher training and other heal member related trainings which kind of gave an orientation to all these terminologies and aspects and how trauma looks different in different communities and so on. So i I would say a strong reliance on that. Like safety is one of the core principles of a trauma informed approach. So, when it comes to safety, there is physical, emotional, and social safety. So, physical safety, I think I answered in another question already about making the space welcoming and being able to like create that feeling of safety just with the physical space alone. Like for us, I think we also as the sessions progressed, displayed the participants' artworks on the table and on the walls and so on, so that it feels more like their safe space rather than an external agency space. Now, when it comes to emotional and social safety, again, as I mentioned before, we took care to prioritize their own personal needs, like any immediate personal needs that they came up with, like that they came with into the session before moving into the program or the evaluation aspects. And in terms of social safety, the team as a whole actively modeled supportive and respectful interactions so that within the group itself we have a fabric which is very heavily rooted in that entire cohesiveness of what the word safety and the principle of safety includes. So, yeah, I would say to add on with all the things that Jasmine and Ruth has listed, this is the only thing like re-traumatization, constant challenge, and yeah, relying on on a trauma-informed approach.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for summing that up, Shruti. And I appreciate that you also, yes, safety, I think, rings through everyone's sharing. And, it was as sometimes simple as in our first baseline questionnaire, we asked, what supports your regulation? What supports you as a person in the program as well as outside of the program, so that the facilitators already knew what supported that individual. And I'll just add on before we go to our last final question that when we conducted our quantitative and qualitative, we also noticed that people were responding to the questions from a collective view, that they weren't just responding from an individual, this is how I feel. It was actually, this is how I feel because my family feels this way. So just a quick example, when we asked, how is your mood? They were enjoying the session, everything. But if their child was having a hard day at school, or their, partners or their families, cousins, uncles, and aunts were struggling through something, they would answer from that place of collectiveness. So that's just something to keep in mind. How are we also understanding individual versus collective response in what we ask participants? Okay, so with the amount of time remaining, we'll keep this last question brief for all of us because I want to get to one question in the Q&A that's very good. But what is the most important considerations when translating program data into actionable items, whether that's for organizations or policymakers? And this is a little bit, of a knowledge mobilization question, but I think it's very valuable to ask. So I'll start off with Shruti first, so you can, share your thoughts on this one.
Um, I'd say, since I have to be brief, when translating program data, the first step is keeping participants and the team central to the meaning making process in qualitative data. That is the first step. And now, once you have the meaning making and the results coming from it, translating it into organizational level insights. I think Christen spoke to it at the very beginning of this webinar about how connecting the findings from the research to practice changes within the staff in an agency. Like, for example, if the data is showing that expressive arts strengthens social connections and community connections for newcomer women, then ensuring that at an organizational level, your settlement support workers are made aware of arts based programming that is happening at the agency so that they can offer that as a complementary offering alongside the settlement related aspects that they're providing to the community health center clients. Now, when it comes to translating this for policymakers, I would say providing context, program description, and results in a very clear and logical sequence so that the pathway from the evidence to the recommendation for the policymakers is clearly legible to them, in a very concise format. And also, along with the research, try to convey the human reality of the data. And in HEAL, we try to do this through the persona related knowledge mobilization materials that we created. But yeah, those would be my brief words on that.
Thank you, thank you. And for those here, I will send out the persona link that Shruti is talking about, so don't worry. I'm going to pass it on to Jasmine, and then Ruth can have the last response.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep it super brief, but for me, knowledge mobilization is about bridging the gap between research and practice. So the goal isn't just to create long reports and generate evidence, but make sure the evidence leads to meaningful improvements within programs, organizations, services, ultimately for better outcomes for the community. So, I think the main thing is making sure knowledge mobilization is accessible and practical. We need clear recommendations for what can be used within the community. And I think one thing that often sometimes gets missed is making sure that these findings, these pieces are shared back with the community in a way that they will understand. So their experiences had shaped the research, the outcomes. So they should be able to see how their contributions has helped improve the programs and how they are going to inform future work. And again, this comes back to building the relationship and the trust between the community and researchers. So if we share our findings and our outcomes with them and show them and highlight how important they are, the community and the trust continues to build, and this helps future programs.
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. Knowledge mobilization every step of the way. Okay, Ruth, go for it.
Okay, I will try to be fast, but this is my favorite question because it is in my program of research. I am very interested in looking at how organizations in the sector can reclaim evaluation as a source of reflection instead of scrutiny, right? So just reminder that very quickly we live in an audit society, right? So programs are constantly having to be measured and scrutinized so that organizations compete against each other. But there is room to reclaim evaluation for more critical work because it is more than most journals, peer-reviewed journals, evaluation data is actually the knowledge base that funders use to decide who they're going to fund and which programs work. So just kind of that reminder. My biggest suggestion, I have many, but I'll only do one, is to encourage folks to think about what collective impact how you can measure collective impact. So organizations working with each other to kind of strategically find measures, common measures to measure impact in their own ways. So in this context, I am working with a partner around cross Filipino organizations, thinking about how Filipino organizations could start tracking or measuring similar things so that we can celebrate our collective impact. I do think arts-based programs should find room to collectively organize around evaluation so that they can prove to funders worldwide the efficacy of the work they're doing along the same terms, right? And on your own terms. So there is, I think, room to organize around evaluation in very strategic ways that can lift up the sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. And I know there's so much to be said. And I will say to everyone, I will constantly, be sharing resources with you all. So whatever is not said in this webinar, we will get to. So yeah, lastly, just to say, arts can humanize research, and I think we can dig more deep into what that means for us. So I'm going to get to one of our questions. We have a couple minutes here. So thank you, Barry Van, shared about, yeah, the work with GBV survivors, building trust. So the question here is, have you found any particular approaches or practices especially effective for building trust with participants during these sessions? I think we kind of touched upon it, but if we want to just share, 1 to 2 sentences each about effective trust building approaches, you can unmute and respond to that.
I think I can very briefly mention that the words that you speak to the participants, like you make a promise that you would make this referral, or that you would check in at this point of time, or that you would call for an interview at this point of time. It's a small thing, but make sure that you follow through so that over time, those repeated words and actions together build the trust with the participants. Because often, yeah, I mean, we might just take it like such a granted thing, but it is so much more important for the participants that whatever you say, like referrals, connections, calls, everything, that you follow through exactly as you said. Like, don't try to give surprises, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Shruti. The follow through is so important. Yeah, others?
Mine can be quick because I think we've mentioned a lot of like the big strategies around collaborative design, making it relational, being integrated, evaluators not swooping in and swooping out. I think one thing that has really worked is like it sounds like a small detail, but is food, right? So when we come together in evaluation, making sure that people are nourished and or maybe even sharing a meal or even if it's one-on-one to create room to have tea, share tea, bring in relational aspects into the process that make it feel less like research and more like collaboration.
Yes, yes. I'll add a quick one. One thing that we did was every session we asked somebody for their favorite song and we would play their favorite song. And then at the end of the 12 sessions, we had a whole playlist. And I think those small moments where someone feels special to share, show and tell is such an immense gift, I think, to folks where a lot of the times they don't feel special in their own context. So that was a huge one. And yeah, Jasmine, do you want to add another one?
I'm just going to echo on everything that was said, but consistency from the researcher's perspective, researcher is really important because long-term relationships, trust building, if you show up in a consistent way, how Shruti was saying, checking in when you're supposed to check in, whether it's like food, bringing in food or meals, and even songs, like it's so important because it shows the participants that you will show up no matter what. Also like adding to like the songs and the food, like the collective art pieces that the groups had done, it was not necessarily a part of the program, but it was added in between. But it's just like so much stuff can come up organically within the program that might not necessarily be integrated previously, but it helps build the trust. But I'm gonna end there.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, and having a honest conversation with your teammates. What is our capacity to be responsive? Figure that out before entering into your program. So with the final minute left, some of the other questions in the chat are about, yeah, are there examples of art-based evaluation tools, templates, resources? 100%. Part of the one of the knowledge mobilization pieces out of this project was we built a whole website, a website that housed every single tool, quantitative and qualitative survey that we used. So we want to be very transparent about what we use. So please check out the website. Thank you, Marco, for putting that in the chat. And we continue to update the website with tools that we found super helpful. So check back. And we hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. It was so filled with wisdom, concrete examples, and the conversation continues. Spark that conversation with your colleagues when you go back into your workplace or communities. And all to say is that we hope to see you next week, Tuesday, July 14th. We invite back our HEAL facilitators to talk more about their experiences supporting facilitators in very intensive program implementations. So don't miss that. And until then, have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.